Here we are at lesson number 12 of chapter 4. This is the final lesson of 12 lessons in how to develop your own chapter 4. As you can see through the lesson strategy for all the lessons of this chapter 4 series, if you listen to them in order, then you have a good understanding now exactly what needs to be considered for writing chapter 4. In this lesson, in particular, I will address how to write chapter 4 of your doctoral dissertation, some of the highlights from this lesson strategy, which I hope you'll keep in mind. Then, as with every other lesson, I'll conclude with a reflective summary. In chapter 4, it's about presenting the data. That's the title of chapter 4, presenting the data. Chapter 4 will allow you the opportunity to take all the data that you collected and put it into a format that other people will be able to understand. And you're just going to present the data, nothing else. Meaning that as you present the data, you're not going to describe what that means. You're not going to make any recommendation. You're not going to assess the data. You will provide some meaning in regards to perhaps how the themes came to be or how you tested your null hypothesis, because after all, there is meaning behind the result of testing that hypothesis. You will have in chapter 4, more than likely, other than the narrative, also figures and tables. Some of you who are listening to this program will include both figures and tables, and some of you may not. A lot of this is going to be dependent upon what your data is and the guidance you have from your dissertation chair in your university. As you know from listening to the program, I believe that figures and tables add value, and whenever possible, I have my mentees provide those figures and tables in every chapter as well as chapter 4. I'd like to have the view of not only the dissertation committee members or the university reviewers, but that of the person who's going to read your work years from now. They may not want to read the narrative. They may be able to learn from your tables and figures without having to read the narrative, or they'll see the value of your figures and tables that are developed well and then realize the need to read the narrative. In your chapter after the introduction, I encourage you to provide information about your field test or pilot study first. Oftentimes, if you've done a field test, you may have chapter 3 contain information about the field test. There's nothing wrong with including in chapter 4 some information about that field test. If you have a pilot study, then you would want to address the pilot study after the introduction section of your chapter 4. Again, remember, provide statements without analysis. A statement might be, perhaps, that the null hypothesis was tested and the testing failed to reject the null. That's a statement, no analysis. It's just presenting the outcome. A statement could mean that of all the interviews that you have done, 6 themes emerged and 4 sub-themes. Again, you would give those themes and sub-themes, but not analyze what they actually mean, or even how the sub-themes relate to the major themes. Describe the survey population. Help your reader who may not have read chapter 3 understand your survey population. Did you have 18 people that you interviewed before data saturation was achieved? If perhaps you gave surveys to 800 people and you received 350 back, but out of the 350 received back, only 330 of them were usable, is that the kind of information that you described for your reader to understand? Chapter 4 is about going from very broad to very narrow. Remember, if you did interviews, let's just say you interviewed 18 people with 5 interview questions. Your transcribed data of all that conversation might actually be 200 pages long. That's very broad. That's a lot of information that you're going to narrow it down to a couple themes and sub-themes perhaps. If you collected survey data and you had 330 surveys, that's a lot of data. That's very broad. You're going to take that and distill it down into the findings of what that means statistically in regards to testing that null hypothesis and the results of that. So consider chapter 4 of going from very broad down to very narrow. Meaning is generated but not assessed. In essence, as I mentioned already, in this lesson and many of the other lessons for perhaps the null hypothesis testing, you provide that it was rejected or failed to be rejected, but you don't provide anything more than that on what that actually has to do with the outcome of answering the research questions. That you'll do in Chapter 5. You're going to summarize data. You're going to summarize data in Chapter 4 in that manner that takes that broad scope of information down to something that people are going to be able to understand, perhaps in your themes and sub-themes that were generated, any new information that perhaps was not seen before, and perhaps as you're doing a quantitative work on how all that data is summarized into the findings that you have. Explain the data treatment. For example, if the data that you had from your phenomenological or case study interviews, you took the transcripts and put them into NVivo or Atlas software, and that generated themes and nodes, then include that's how you treated the data through NVivo software. If in quantitative work you've used SPSS, that's the treatment of your data. Make sure in Chapter 4 that you give that information, even if in Chapter 3, under your data analysis plan, you allude to it as well. There's nothing wrong with having this type of information in both chapters. Again, remember that person who may not read Chapter 3 and may only be reading Chapters 4 and 5. Provide the mechanics of the analysis, meaning what kind of test did you run? Did you run a t-test, a chi-square test? Anything that you have done as far as the mechanics behind it to get the results. Perhaps the formulas for testing your null hypothesis. Make sure that those are there. The mechanics means what actually happened in that analysis phase to produce that outcome that you're presenting in regards to your data. There's no references other than those references that are required, perhaps for giving the references behind the formulas that you're using to test your hypotheses. If you have to use a t-test, as I mentioned in the quantitative lessons in this chapter series, give the source and where you got that t-test from, give the formula, and then of course you put your information into that formula and show the reader. In that case, you would cite somebody. But there's no referencing here from perhaps the literature review. That's what more so this means, because that's already done. There's no need to do any references other than to the formulas in regards to research and designs, because that's already in Chapter 3. In regards to the introduction of your Chapter 4, things to keep in mind. The purpose of your study should be included into the introduction section of Chapter 4. Also, if not included in your purpose statement, include the research method and design so that the reader of your chapter understands fully not only what the purpose of your study was, but also the method and design applied. In most instances, a good purpose statement contains the research method and design, so you don't have to put it in there twice if it's in your purpose of the study statement. Make sure you give enough information in case the reader does not read the other chapters. This is subjective, and you're going to have to decide how much needs to go into your introduction of Chapter 4. If not certain, go back and review the lesson, which was Lesson 11, where I gave information about how to write and design your introduction section to Chapter 4. Give the same focus as every other heading's content in the chapter. Don't take the chance on just putting one quick paragraph in the introduction of your chapter thinking that it's not important. Every heading, every chapter, every sentence is important in your dissertation. Keeping in mind, again, maybe the reader of your work 2 years from now may not have read or wanted to read the first 3 chapters. Give them enough information here so they know what's in Chapter 4 and entice them enough to want to read Chapter 4. In regards to qualitative work, if you have qualitative work presented in your Chapter 4, keep in mind you want to present them perhaps by themes, maybe topics in priority order. You're going to have to establish that order of how you're going to present your themes, and make sure in the introduction section you help the reader understand how that is going to be provided for them. Quotes from survey participants. This is critical. You should quote interviewees on what they've said that generated the themes that you are presenting in your Chapter 4. You don't have to cite every one of them in regards to every interviewee who had something to say, but give some evidence of support on how the theme was born. Prioritize your themes, whether it be by how many people frequently said something that generated a theme, or perhaps it could be a theme that's generated that was not expected, and that's the one you want to write about first. That would still be prioritization based on perhaps new knowledge or unexpected outcomes. In a quantitative chapter 4, some things to keep in mind there are statistical calculations. Make sure you have the right formulas. Make sure your statistical calculations are correct. I encourage you, before you get too far into writing chapter 4, after you've done the statistical calculations, let somebody else run them as well, or double check your mathematics to make sure that the actual answers that you have as a result of the calculations are accurate. Keep in mind, you're testing the null hypothesis. And in chapter 4, you're merely going to suggest through the testing, was the null hypothesis rejected or failed to be rejected? Those are the only two possible outcomes I have been trained to write about and expect in chapter 4, or for any null hypothesis testing. It's not about accepting or not accepting the hypothesis. It's about rejecting or failing to reject the null hypothesis, because it's the null hypothesis which is tested. I encourage you, in a quantitative chapter 4, once you get past your pilot study, then present your chapter 4 from research question number 1, and then sequentially 2, 3, 4, however many research questions you have. And stay consistent as well. In research question number 1, for example, you'll probably start out with a narrative. Then you'll perhaps have a table or figure that presents data and the formula, and then another narrative paragraph that ends the section, that ends actually with a sentence about rejecting or failing to reject the null. Whatever format and flow you use for research question number 1, I encourage you to do the same for research question number 2, 3, and so on. In the conclusion to your chapter, I encourage you then to also regurgitate, if you will, or cut and paste your purpose statement again. Put that in there so at the end of the chapter, people understand what the purpose of your dissertation was. Again, give the research method and design if not included in the purpose statement information that you provided. Give the same focus as every other heading's content. Don't believe that just because you've got everything done that a quick paragraph will get you out of chapter 4 and into chapter 5. That may be true, but it won't serve you well when you have to go back and revise the conclusion of your chapter 4. 2 or 3 paragraphs is enough for the conclusion of chapter 4. Also, at the end of chapter 4, you should have a transition paragraph, not just one sentence or two, but a transition paragraph on what's expected or what the reader will find in chapter 5. Now, for all your information in chapter 4, in regards to reflective summary, keep in mind, if you have a mixed method study, you're going to have to address both quantitative and qualitative. Make sure as you do that, you indicate what type of data, whether you have nominal data or nil data for each of the areas that you're relating to. Make sure that also that in chapter 4 on a mixed method study, depending what the priority is, that's how you should design the chapter 4. For example, in your mixed method study, if in fact you did a qualitative portion first and you did interviews to generate information, perhaps to create themes that you then create a quantitative survey for, write your chapter in essence from the qualitative work done first and then the quantitative. If by chance you did the quantitative portion first in your research in the mixed method study, perhaps you did a survey, and then you took the survey results and then went and did interviews with people in the population, then write to that quantitative part first and then the qualitative part to give you that mixed method outcome. In the chapter 4 lesson series, I've addressed 12 different discrete lessons. Some of the information has been repeated from one section to the next because it's common, and it's understandable that as you do some information presenting in a quantitative study, it's going to be the same for the qualitative study. And I encourage you, if you're at this part of the lesson strategy and perhaps you're only doing qualitative, I encourage you to listen to the quantitative lessons. And if you're only doing quantitative, that you listen to the qualitative lessons. It will help you become a better consumer of research and give you ideas to consider should you have questions in your oral defense. This is Dr. Rich Shuttler. I want to thank you for your support in procuring these lessons on how to complete Chapter 4 of your dissertation. It's been a pleasure to have you procure my lesson strategy to help you. I encourage you, if you have any questions or concerns, to email me. If I can help you, I will. If you found this lesson strategy helpful, please do me a favor and perhaps your peers and cohort members. Send them over to my website. Let them see if there's information there in any of the lesson strategies or the free webinars that I do. I also encourage you, if you're still working on your dissertation work, at whatever stage you're at, even if you're perhaps earlier than that in content classes still, look at my website every couple months and join the free webinars. I'd love to have you there in a continuing educational type of program. I always give tips and strategies that will help students out at every level of their education. And keep me posted on your progress. I'd certainly love to hear from you when you graduate. If nothing else, you're welcome to go to my Facebook group titled Taking the B Out of ABD and send a little note there, particularly if you found value in this program or as you complete your studies or perhaps get your proposal approved and then your dissertation approved. Just send a note there because, one, you'll be a leader of others because those who are following behind you will see that you're doing it and you can be a great inspiration to others. Again, I'm Dr. Rich Shuttler. Thank you very much for your support.